Good evening, and welcome to the second Clergy Roundtable of 2021. And my name is Dawson Taylor, and I have the great privilege of serving as Senior Minister of Naples United Church of Christ, as well as being a part of this wonderful clergy team that includes my colleagues and friends, Reverend Dr. Deb Kaiser-Cross, who serves as Minister for Congregational Care, and Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, who serves as Assistant Minister. And as we begin tonight, we are studying the book, The World is About to Turn, Mending a Nation's Broken Faith, and by Rick Rouse and Paul Ingram. And I do want to mention that there is a foreword by Peter Marty that Sharon talked about last week and invited Deb and I to talk about, and Deb and I both had pretty, I think, enthusiastic endorsements of the foreword, which is, I'll speak for myself, but I think Deb mentioned this as well. I don't tend to be a big foreword reader, but I think Peter does a great job of summarizing where we are as a country in this time. And Peter Marty also happens to be the editor of the Christian Century, which is a well-respected periodical. And so I would encourage you, even if you don't read along with us, to go to Amazon.com or wherever you order books from, and to order this book and read it. It's a relatively easy read and quick read, because I think this book has a lot to say about where we are, especially where we find ourselves today, particularly. I also want to remind you before we jump in that each of our clergy roundtables are archived on livestream.com, on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. And so last Wednesday, we began the Clergy Roundtable, and that was the day that we faced the terrible situation where the U.S. Capitol was stormed. And so we are keenly aware that people were probably otherwise engaged in watching things that were unfolding on national news. And so if you want to go back and start from the beginning to cover the first chapter and the foreword, you can certainly do that. And then, of course, this will be archived as well if you want to pass it along to friends. Because tonight we're discussing the second chapter, which is entitled When Justice Rolls Down, Finding the Moral Courage to Do What Is Right. Because, as again, Sharon, who got us started quite well, pointed out that the first three chapters cover from the prophet Micah 6:8. And I just wanted to remind us of what the prophet says. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? What shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? What shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? God has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And so I think that's an important word as we begin tonight. And so as we begin, I just want to say words of gratitude to our production team, Nick and Alex, who are with us tonight to record. And of course, we always want to say thank you to Wendy Gayer, our executive assistant, who keeps things running smoothly for us. And I want to say thank you to Sharon and Chuck, who gave me these fantastic socks for Christmas. David and Deb's gift can't be shown because it involves really wonderful wine glasses, so I can't bring those onto into a church recording. So as we get started, as I mentioned, this chapter is on justice, which we actually, before we went live, we were talking, can, in my words, ironically sometimes be, even in a church setting, a, quote, hot button issue. And we're going to talk about in just a second who I think we other the most, because we talked about othering last week, and that seems to be a topic we talk about anyway. But I'm curious as we begin why you think in today's culture justice is such a, in my words, hot button topic or issue. And I'll jump in. I think that I think the word has been misappropriated from work around advocating for those who have less and who have not been given perhaps the same opportunities, or for equality. I think it's been misappropriated or put to use to those who march in the streets, who destroy property, who cause violence. And sometimes those are ways that people carry out justice, and people carry out justice in lots of different ways. But I think that for some reason, that's how people appropriate justice. And I don't, in my faith world, see it that way. But I think that sometimes people do. And so I think when we talk about justice in the context of the church, that's what people conjure. And so when we say we're going to do this justice event or this justice cause, that's what people conjure in their minds. So for me, that's why I think sometimes we have those challenges. Sharon, you have a distinct role on our team because you work with our newly formed Justice Committee, and you do tremendous justice work in our community.
Well, thank you. It's interesting because just this morning we had a meeting of the Justice Committee, and this very question came up. The question of why are people so afraid, particularly in the context of the church, to say justice, and why is it controversial to have a Justice Committee or to talk about doing justice work? And I don't have an easy answer, and I think it's different in different churches. But I really appreciate the fact that you read from verse 6 and not just verse 8. It's ironic, but this is the passage, the entire passage, the very first biblical exegesis I ever did in seminary in Old Testament 101, the first fall semester. And it has always stuck with me because I think the contrast between what the prophet is saying is, well, what are all of these religious practices you want us to do, and these sacrifices and these assemblies, and isn't that what you want, God? And the response is, no, God told us what God wants, and it isn't about just what we do in a sanctuary or what solemn practices we engage in. It's about how we live. And we'll talk in subsequent sessions more about the loving kindness and compassion and walking humbly with God. This is obviously focused on justice, but that's about living rightly with God and one another. And Micah's not the only prophet. If the words "when justice rolls down" comes from Amos. I mean, the prophets were full of this is what God wants from us. But if I go from the biblical text to contemporary context, and you mentioned the othering, I think it is very tragic, and we see it in current events, that we have so dichotomized and polarized positions so that, I mean, there's name calling. And I'll tell you, a few years ago, I was attending a meeting of the Board of Education of the Collier County Public Schools. And those of you who've been to board meetings anywhere know that there's usually a time of public expression and things. And someone whom I will, for lack of knowledge to be more specific, call conservative, was railing against the school district and saying that they've been taken over by social justice warriors. And I thought to myself, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that happening in the schools anywhere, let alone in Florida. But that's that stereotyping, and maybe they're teaching something in school that I don't want them to be teaching, so it's all those bad social justice people, and then we have on the other side the whatever kind of crazy name we want to give to them. And so I agree, it's misappropriated, it's misunderstood, it's used as a name calling. One of the things that the Justice Committee in this church would like to do is to see us be able to talk about this very question, so that as we try to move forward in justice ministries, we don't have to worry that we're scaring people, that there's a trust that we are trying to understand and follow what God calls us to do. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
No, I sincerely appreciate it because, again, I think you help bring a unique perspective. Again, not only because of your work in our community, but because, really because you work hand in hand. You are the staff liaison to our Justice Committee, and I have great respect and appreciation for you, for your ministry, but for our Justice Committee, because I do think they walk a fine line. And we've talked a lot about that as a team, about the ways in which they are working to help us address issues of justice, but to do it in a way that doesn't, hit people's buttons, but also answering the question of why does it hit people's buttons?
So I'm going to come at it from the pastoral perspective, because I appreciate what you have both said, and I do know it's a hot button issue. And here's why I think it is. I think people perceive justice conceptually as a wonderful thing. But it's when you get down to the specific topics that they might not agree with that particular stand on justice, that people are afraid it will divide the church like our nation is divided. That, I think, is the fear that is underneath all of that. So I do really think, if we can't talk about it here, where in the heck are we going to talk about it? And so I know that the Justice Committee has tried to take on specifically some issues that there might be some really civil conversation around in the church, so that people can understand that it does not have to, the church's way of dealing with justice does not have to reflect the way our bigger culture is responding to it. By demonizing each other, by more and more division, I think this church really wants to have a conversation that can be healing, reconciling, respectful. They're the only words I know how to use for this.
No, I think that's a really important point, and especially on a day, I mean, I just can't not acknowledge the irony or the what's before us as a nation, as you raise that, Deb, which I think is really important. I mean, here we are on a day where the House of Representatives brings articles of impeachment, and so we see just increasing divisiveness at the national level. And it's really not about, in my opinion, it's not about how one feels about that action. I'm just simply saying we see that increased division at the national level. And as we talk about as a team, and as I've written about, and I know that you all are in agreement with, is I believe that the church has become the last place in our society where people who disagree and differ on numerous issues can gather and talk about those things. And so I think you do raise a really important point, Deb, that this is one of the last places that people can talk about some of those things, and people don't want that changed or ruined.
They're scared that this will become as much a battleground as the culture around us is. And we wouldn't be here if we thought that would happen.
Right.
We want to have conversations about justice so that we can figure out ways to move forward and be the church that Jesus really would respect, be proud of,
Would recognize.
would recognize.
Yeah. So I wonder, I just, before we get to the othering piece, I wonder as pastors and as members of the Justice Committee, how we reassure or how we lead in those efforts in the recognition that people have that fear. Because we talk about when people make decisions in fear, that they are very rarely, if ever, good decisions. And so how do we reassure our congregation? How do we reassure people who that are driven by that concern or that fear?
Well, I will answer just in one small way. In the classes I do, I use what I call small group guidelines. And within those are guidelines like we will listen to each other, we will respect our differences. If we disagree, we do it with respect and kindness. And if we can't, then we are silent. If we can't do it that way. And I think that there have to be some guidelines for discourse on this subject because people get so triggered by the topics.
Yeah.
Not all of them. I mean, we can start with agreeing on some justice issues that most of us are on the same page with. Climate crisis, for the most part, I think most people are willing to have that conversation without raised voices in a room. But I do think certain guidelines to frame our conversation would be super helpful in the church.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think for me, the foundation of trust. And so I find myself constantly asking myself how we continuously build trust among each other and trust, because I've actually had a lot of conversations recently with colleagues, with my father, and with others. I don't know that I've really raised it yet with us as a team, but there is an increasing distrust of leaders in our culture today. And so as faith leaders, that means there's increasing distrust of people basically who stand in front of people. I mean, that's just the reality. And so I think we have to work extra hard to earn people's trust. And so how do we do that? What does that look like? Because I think I think it's probably hand in glove, is when we have those guidelines, we have to have a foundation of trust to help steer those conversations and to help have that foundation.
Yeah.
And Sharon, I was just curious if you had...
Well, and I'm thinking about a number of things in terms of how you have that conversation, and something that one of you said triggered for me the fact that we've started by talking about justice in Micah and as a foundation of the Hebrew Scriptures. But this book is also Mending a Nation's Broken Faith. So we also have justice out there as an American concept, not a Christian concept, but with liberty and justice for all. So there's a whole political, social, societal understanding of, well, what does justice for all mean? And I don't think that they're the same. I don't even think they should be the same, because within the church, that is out of our sense of revelation from God through time and history and scripture. And the American concept may draw on that somewhat, but it's also a historical democratic concept. And what it made me think is to develop trust, to have meaningful conversations, requires authenticity, that we are speaking what we really believe, not what we think somebody wants us to hear, or in the opposite, what we think somebody doesn't want to hear and we just want to bug them. But it also requires precision. Because if we're all talking about justice and we mean different things, we're going to be talking at cross purposes. And so we don't have to enter or even necessarily leave with the same concept, But I have to be clear when I'm talking about justice, what are the things I'm talking about? And when somebody else is, what are the things that they're talking about? Because it may not be the same. So this is a thought I haven't really had before, but we have to be precise in our language, and maybe that gets back to not calling each other names and not assuming we know what other people think, but actually listening and learning and then reflecting, okay, what do I really think and how do I say that as clearly and precisely as I can?
Listening to you say that, I think about the four agreements. And one of the four agreements is, and I'm not going to quote it directly, you may remember it, but it is about be precise with your words or be, is it precise? Is that, I don't think that's the right word,
Intentional,
but
maybe?
yeah, something like
Something
that.
like that.
But it talks about, like, it's essentially say what you mean and mean what you say, essentially, is kind of how I always think about it. But I think you're exactly right. And then, Deb always reminds us to assume the best of people's intentions.
And one of the other agreements is to refuse to take anything
Personally, yeah.
which I think is really important, because what happens in these conversations that get us triggered is that we think we are being disrespected personally when somebody has a completely different opinion than us. Instead of being able to detach ourselves from it, to listen and be curious about the other person and what they think and why they think it, without engaging our reactive emotions. So,
Yeah, and I've often had that conversation with people to talk about, I can get very passionate about, either an issue or frankly, how to lead the church or a direction the church is going or something, but it's rarely personal, that I get impassioned, but then I can disengage from that passionate conversation and still have relationship. It's only when it becomes personal or attacks become personal for me that I go, whoa, this is not where that was going, for me. And because I have very vehement disagreements on, quote, social issues with people that I love very dearly. Some who are members of this church, some who are personal friends, some are just influences in my life. And sometimes it means we just don't talk about those things because of the value of the relationship. We've all come through the holidays, albeit most of us different, but I think we can all respect and understand that some of us don't have those conversations with family or certain family members because we value, those relationships. I think we've gone to preaching now, so I'll stop. But I was curious, even just on the first page and moving into the chapter, I think the authors do a tremendous job in this chapter of talking about the us, them, inside, outside, things like that. And so I found myself wondering, who do you believe that we in today's culture other the most? Because I think, unfortunately, I laugh because I think, unfortunately, the country, and then we talked some last week about how the Christian church has judged and pushed out people, and we have a long history of that. And so, who do you believe today is the group that we other the most?
there's a large group
Well,
of
and that was the
them.
thing. So I will be very honest. It was difficult, and I will give you my top two.
Okay.
Well, and I'm going to ask you when you say we.
Okay,
Who are we?
fair point.
I.
Because we are in the church, I think that's where we ought to go. Because so that's a very fair question, Sharon. Because I think I really started with the nation. But I think we really owe it to ourselves to really talk about the church, which probably changes my answer a little bit. But so I think when I was thinking more globally, I really thought about immigrants. Again, in this day and time, I think we struggle with, and I think part of that is driven by we have unclear policies as a country, and so that's driven our society and thus the church. I think the church has been lagging on this. But I have watched that I believe transgender women, and particularly transgender women of color, are, because I believe it's an area in which we ignore. And we have alarmingly high rates of murder, and we are, the church is silent virtually on this issue, and I'm as much silent as anyone else. It's a self critique as anything else, but I'm aware that I think there's a lot of people who are very uncomfortable around transgender people, and then that gets ever more so around people of color. And so I just think that's kind of a perfect storm in today's culture. So I think that could be a little bit of a radical answer, and I recognize that. But for me, I tried to go to like the nth degree
Okay.
was where I went with that.
Well, for me, I could go down the list, but I think we other anybody we don't have contact with
Okay, yeah.
much. I think about our segregated neighborhoods. So I'm going to other somebody. If I don't have any contact with Hispanics, I might other Hispanics. Our neighborhoods are so segregated that any ethnic diversity, any racial diversity, we tend to other. I would say that the urban suburban versus rural, we other each other.
Wow, I think that's an important one. I
It's
really do.
really important in our country today because we don't get each other. We don't understand each other's lifestyles. We don't understand each other's communities because we have no contact. And I think, I mean, I can go down the list. I'll agree with immigrants. It's whoever we have no contact with, and we tend to stereotype.
Yeah. I'm intrigued by the rural and the urban, because I think that's a divide that, having grown up mostly in urban areas, but I did grow up I did have some growing up experiences in rural areas, and that is a deep divide in our country, and it has to do with how we apportion tax dollars and I think how churches function. And frankly, resources that denominations give out and things like that. I think that's got me thinking. Yeah, that's interesting.
Within the context of the church, I would say we are pretty good at othering people who believe differently than we do. So whether that's the Roman Catholics, who have a hierarchy that we choose not to want to have, or whether it's very fundamentalist, independent Christian congregation in our community, it certainly fits Deb's definition. There are people with whom I have very little contact, much of it by my choice, because I know, I believe, that were I to go to that church, and I don't have any particular church in mind, but that I would not be welcomed because of being a female clergy member or because of holding views that I do about God's acceptance of gays and lesbians or any number of other things. And that's one of the hardest places where we figure out how to talk to each other and to say this oneness that we say we have in Christ should mean something, and how do we work on that? It's interesting and difficult for me in one sense to think about this only as in othering, at least as if it's a conscious thing, because one of the groups that I feel like we still allow the greatest injustice is our black siblings. And it's where none of us would say that we think there's anything but equality before God among all of us, and yet we don't have that contact that makes us know each other as individuals enough. And we, in terms of justice, don't do enough to be making life just for them. And so it's not exactly the same as othering, but if I'm talking about justice and groups within the church and the community, I think I just have to lift that up.
I think what you raised, though, Sharon, is really important because, Deb, something you said about those whom we interact with. And I was thinking about when I moved to Naples over 7 years ago now, I had the most interesting experience, and that was, and Debbie, you and I have talked about this, of interacting with the Haitian community. Because in Texas, at least in my experience, there's not a very distinct Haitian community. And so I had very little, if ever, any interaction. And so that was literally a new community for me to interact with. And I just remember thinking, here I am in my mid 30s, and I'm like being introduced to almost an entirely new culture, new people, and it was exciting and kind of ironic and all those things. And I don't think I had prejudice or frankly any thoughts about the Haitian community. It just was something I had not really thought about before. But then suddenly there I was with an entirely new culture in front of me by moving to a new part of the country. And it was exciting and different, but there it was in front of me, and how important that interaction was. And then Sharon, something you said about the racial, so these are my words, but the racial tensions that still exist. And I don't want to misrepresent what you said, but the racial tensions that exist in our country. I wrote off to the side in one of the parts of the chapter about one of the pictures that is so stuck in my mind about the storming of the Capitol last week was the picture of the individual who was carrying the Confederate flag. And there was a piece, Bill Moyers carried it on his website. It wasn't authored by him. But he talks about how it was the first time that we know of that the Confederate flag was flown at the U.S. Capitol. And I was just struck by how deeply painful that must be for our black siblings, especially after the year that we've come through in 2020, and how much that must set back the important work, I believe, that collectively we have done and attempted to do. But I just thought about, that was just another level of pain that day brought to our country.
Well, and that I would agree with, and I think in the conversations that we had last summer and in reading I've continued to do, I've had an increased appreciation for just how painful that flag is. Mm-hmm. I think as a young person, I thought it was stupid, mm-hmm. but I did not see it in the way I see it now. Because now, for me now, the analogy is how it must feel to see a swastika. Mm. The sign of the people who were against us and who lost. Yeah. And I think thinking about the fact that, and I've done some reading, that in Germany there is no veneration of the side that lost. Mm. And I just have this new pain about the way that we do lift up the people who were trying to break apart the country so that they could have slaves. So seeing that, and I would only be the 10,000th person to have commented, and it was said again in our meeting this morning, that I think most people would acknowledge if those rioters were black or brown, something different would have happened and they would have been treated differently. So when I think of issues, racism and, and I've got a good friend, and we were talking about the anti-Semitism that was also
I was going to
very
say, I think that's
evident,
an important part too. Yeah.
very evident that day. We have a lot of work to do. And some of it is about accountability. That I remember I had my Christian ethics professor in seminary. His name was Snuffy Smith. And he was from rural Virginia. And he said, "I'm a redneck." And he meant it literally, because living in the hills, he had a redneck. But he was a very progressive Christian ethicist. And he talked about mercy comes after accountability. I mean, it's not a blanket, we're going to make everything better by just forgiving and forgetting. There needs to be accountability for the harms that have been done, and then the mercy comes after that. So these are just tough issues, and I feel like I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but I do think it's not an elephant in the room, it's something in the room that has to be talked about.
Yeah, and I think we will continue to speak about it. And I want to move into a subchapter, a sub part of the chapter that they title Faith Communities and Justice. And I think it actually echoes part of what we were talking about earlier, and something that Deb raised is when it talks about, they ask the question, and to me, this is part of the subchapter of Mending a Nation's Broken Faith. But it says, what does it mean? This is on page 22. If you're following along as reading along with us, it says, what does it mean to live in a community that acts with justice, whether it be a religious or secular group? And it says, the first sign of justice is willingness to have the conversation about what is just or unjust. And so, again, you'll note, they don't say it means to agree. It means that you're willing to have the conversation. And so I believe that the church's responsibility is to provide safe places to have the conversation. So again, my belief about the foundation being trust, Deb talking about the ground rules, so to speak, and then Sharon talking about the avenues by which we do that, i.e., Justice Committee and things like that. And then, they talk about it's disconcerting to note that approximately 60% of Christian congregations in the United States report that they do not discuss controversial issues.
Okay, I want to make a comment here.
Go, my friend.
I was raised, and I think half this congregation was raised, you don't talk about money or politics or religion or sex in polite company. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that we have stopped having conversations on some of these topics because we're afraid of inappropriateness.
Right. And, so I was going to say there's a meme that I've seen, I've probably passed it along to the two of you, that says that exact thing, and then says that's what's wrong with our country today. Because I think, and I understand, I think there is this balance between, it's not about, how in your face can you be, that's not the point, or how, it's not for shock value, but it is about, again, providing safe places, because Sharon, as you were pointing out just a moment ago, this is the issue in front of us, whether we like it or not. I mean, frankly, I would much rather be talking about other things than what we saw last Wednesday in Washington, D.C., but it is what it is. And so, again, I believe the church can be a safe place to talk about it. And I do think it is framed around issues of justice.
And let me just add one more thing to what I said, is that it is generational. Because my kids talk about all that kind of stuff.
Yes, I've eaten dinner at your family table. They do.
And we have those conversations. So it's a generational thing. My parents were taught that. They taught my generation. I don't know if that's true in your house, but it was kind of like you just don't talk about that stuff.
Well, I want to pause, because we also, I say we because I know Deb has had the privilege as well. We've gotten to know your parents who are very justice-minded. Were you raised that way? I know we've talked about it, but I don't remember. I mean, like, I can't imagine your home being a place where you didn't talk about justice.
We did talk about it, but not, I mean, it was always kind of related to church and talking about church. It's not that we were that involved in as a family.
Yeah.
I don't know that my brothers, for example, came away with the same perspectives that I did in some ways. I think my father is very philosophical and intellectual, so conversations would be more, I think, in that regard than in terms of social things. But it makes me think about just experiences, and I did experience a church where that was integrated and where there were blacks in leadership, and so that was a blessing and colors that I think, in addition to being afraid of, we don't talk about those things. A little bit we talked last week. I think we all want to, at some level, to be right. And so if we really engage and listen to different opinions, there's a risk, number one, I'm going to find out I'm wrong, or be challenged to change my opinions. And that might be some pain in letting go of what I always believed, or it might make me really question my faith or whatever, because I depended on certain principles. And so I think there are lots of reasons that we avoid those kinds of conversations. And in the church, maybe, like as you were saying about your home, Deb, in the church, there's this culture of being nice, and disagreeing isn't always very nice. And so, why bother to upset the apple cart? We know we disagree. What good's going to come out of airing these differences? And I think there are lots of reasons we don't go there.
Well, let's be really clear. The reason that 60% of the churches don't talk about controversial issues, at least from the perspective of the three of us sitting here, is because people like us lose their jobs, lose their livelihood. I mean, at the most basic level, and I'm not even being flippant. I mean, we can all tell war stories all day, and I can tell personal familial stories of when people have stood their ground on issues of justice, that they could stand their ground, but without a paycheck or a home if they lived in a parsonage. And so, I mean, when I read that, I thought that was really interesting to me because I'd never seen that statistic. But I was not surprised by it, because it causes churches to divide, it causes pastors to lose their jobs, it causes deep pain. So I get it. Deb, I find myself wondering, okay, so your parents, we don't talk about that, those issues, or as much.
In public.
Okay.
At home,
So I
it was
misunderstood.
okay.
Excuse me. Okay, I misunderstood.
At home, we could have these
Got it.
conversations.
Okay, I misunderstood.
But you didn't do it in polite company.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay, because I misunderstood, because I was thinking to myself, if that was the case, that you didn't do it at home, then knowing and finding your kids and counting them as friends, curious how that shift happened. No. But it was okay.
I remember my mother and father regularly saying, "Oh, my father was a Republican, my mother was a Democrat, so we canceled each other's votes again."
Yeah.
So we did have those kind of conversations.
Yeah, exactly. No, I totally understand that. Again, in this same subchapter about faith communities and justice, a little further down, they say, what if faith communities became a safe place for honest conversation? What if congregations provided a climate of openness and mutual respect in which people could share their deepest fears and greatest hopes? And I remember thinking recently during our process of working on our bylaws, the church council asked me to work on our goals as a church. And I remember thinking, I wish I had read this book before then, because I basically would write that as a mission statement. I mean, really, in addition to our mission and outreach work, I really would call that a goal, a personal goal, but I know that I think we share it together, of who we want this church to be, because to me, that has a pastoral and congregational care aspect as much as it does a justice aspect.
And I think what it would look like is something that Sharon said at the very beginning of our conversation, is that it requires authenticity and vulnerability and a willingness to engage in a topic that would be difficult for us and that we might be willing to change our mind on. Probably not an easy thing for most of us, because we'll be talking about that in the following
Right.
chapters. But I think it requires honesty, authenticity. This is where I stand. I'm really curious about where you stand. Can we talk about it?
Yeah. I just am struck by the breadth of books that we have studied in Clergy Roundtable, and how often the words authenticity and vulnerability have come up. I mean, I know part of it is because we are all believers and supporters, so to speak, of those ideas, but I just think about those as threads of what we see as part of a healthy church. I didn't know, Sharon, I didn't want to cut you off if you had any
No,
additional thoughts.
I,
Okay.
no,
Well,
I think in terms of the conversation is important. Like many things, I think those kinds of conversations also have to happen in smaller settings,
Yeah.
I agree.
because you can't, you don't have time to listen and learn from a whole lot of people, and it becomes more intimidating and everything else. To get the genuine dialogue, it has to be, and I think it does happen. I guess what I did start to say is I think a church like this, which it's in our DNA to be inclusive and open, has a better chance of offering these kind of opportunities to people, because first of all, we're saying we're open to all points of view. So we don't have a faith test, we don't have a creed. You have to sign on the dotted line to say you believe exactly this way in order to be part of us. So we've opened the door to different points of view, to different experiences. We do have a variety of small classes and study groups. And I think back before COVID, last February, I was leading a book study of Rachel Held Evans' book, Inspired, about new approaches to the Bible. And one of those moments I'll always appreciate, a person in the group said some things that were not necessarily traditional beliefs or whatever, doesn't matter at the moment exactly what they were, but the comment afterward was, there are a lot of churches where I couldn't have said that. And that this person felt safe enough in talking about interpretation of the Bible, and it wasn't a justice issue, but it was just that I'm saying something that I know in another place might be considered heretical. It's contrary to the most orthodox interpretation of faith or something, and that it felt really good to say, I can say that here. So I think we have the foundation. That doesn't mean it's easy to build the building. I mean, but we've got a lot to offer to start that process.
Well, and as you were saying that, one of the things that struck me is it's more difficult to be a theologically progressive church, to welcome the views across the entire spectrum, I believe. I mean, it seems to me it'd be a lot easier to say, this is the only way we believe. You either believe this or you go to another church. And so I get why some churches, in my opinion, find themselves going one theological direction or another and saying, this is who we are, and either get on board or don't. And so there is, in my opinion, there's ease to that because it's a lot more difficult to say we welcome an enormously large range of views theologically, politically, socially, and we're going to bring them all in one place and see what happens, and hold that together in a gloriously rich tension.
Messy, too.
Messy tension is probably a better description. Exactly. At the top of page 23, they're talking about some writing that they say. He goes on to suggest that congregations become a venue for processing loss and acknowledging a world that is no longer. For it is in that processing of grief that hope and new life are born. Yeah. So, Deb, I have to be honest, I wrote out here, you'll love this, Deb-therapy ? Thinking that in the therapeutic work that you do as a licensed counselor, if you have witnessed that firsthand, if you could use names, no, I'm kidding. If you could just, no, but I'm just thinking about you must have witnessed this firsthand, but also on a more personal level, I think about, to be perfectly vulnerable and authentic, that some of the greatest growth that I've experienced in my life has come through the greatest grief.
Absolutely.
And when I've had to work through it, and when I've done that in healthy ways, that's where I've seen the greatest growth. If I'm really honest,
it's
on the other side, yeah.
Because we will fight tooth and nail to hang on to what is comfortable, most of us, which is what's going on culturally. It happens personally and it happens in our culture.
Yeah.
So I used to have this sign in my office that said, the day will come when the pain of hanging on is greater than the pain of letting go. And I really believe that because sometimes hanging on to what always has been comfortable at some point becomes more painful than letting go into change and a new reality. And I think that's kind of what's happening in our culture. The demographics are shifting. People are changing. Our culture is shifting. And people are scared of a cultural shift. They're afraid of letting go of the things that are valuable to them and having to embrace a new reality they don't understand. And I'm not going to go into a long explanation, but I served 2 rural congregations, and I'm still friends with people on Facebook. And I look at the difference in how some of my friends are viewing this cultural shift versus how I'm seeing it. They're clinging to this small town sense of community they feel like they're losing because their young people are moving to the cities. And they miss that lifestyle, and they're afraid it's all changing because of the demographics. And that leads to fear, and that leads to othering. And so that fear of change and letting go is, I think, at the heart of a lot of what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to note, or for us all to need to take note of, is that there is fear and letting go, if you will, on both sides.
Absolutely.
Or on multiple sides, because I'm not sure it's
Yes.
really that cleanly divided. But, there's fear of what does a new presidential administration look like? What does it mean for one party to be, quote, in control of all branches of government? What does it look like for, there is a tremendous shift in our demographics as far as the number of people that are retiring and the demands on Social Security and the demands on, and what does it mean, frankly, in the moment of we were talking about this yesterday. What does it mean for demands on vaccines for COVID-19? I mean, there's just all of these immediate understandings and these shifting understandings that I think cause tremendous angst
Well,
around
and I
us.
don't want to go back and dwell on January 6th, but you see there people proclaiming, we are the true patriots. We are trying to get back the real America. And I mean, you're just two visions of what America is and what the ideal is for us to be. And yeah, letting go of some of those ways of thinking, including that we should all be white Europeans, is really, really difficult. And I think that letting go is very hard. And that I agree completely that in our nation and in the culture that's a lot of it. And I also think even in the church, the way that happens sometimes is we think that our faith is specific acts or specific things that we do or believe. So I can say this because it goes back many years now, but when we started introducing inclusive language and saying that we need to acknowledge that there are women in the sanctuary as well as men, and when we began to talk about God in other ways besides He and Father, and for some people, that was so threatening to let go of the only way they knew how to talk about God, and to realize their faith wasn't in those words, that faith is something much deeper and stronger and can survive new words. But in the church, I think there's a lot, especially I love being UCC, God is still speaking.
Right.
So that means we got to let go of some of the things that we used to think because God's telling us new things.
Yeah, I was with, this was actually the 50th anniversary of the denomination many years ago. At the General Synod that year, it was actually my first General Synod. Walter Brueggemann gave a lecture that I went to, and it was interesting because, one of the other sayings of the United Church of Christ has become, do not put a period where God has put a comma. But Brueggemann said, but don't forget that God was still speaking before the comma. And so I think he was, what I took from that was he was challenging us that, yes, God is still speaking, but what God has said before is still relevant and meaningful. And so it is, again, this holding in tension what has been and what is yet to be, which, again, as a team and working with our leadership, is what does the future post-COVID look like? Because the church is different. We have to acknowledge that reality, and we have to deal with that reality. And so, and we've been dealing with that for the last 10 months. As we wrap up our time, I want to jump ahead again. If you're following along with us, if you're playing the home game, on page 24, they talk about someone I wouldn't identify necessarily as a hero, but someone for whom I've always been intrigued by. They talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a religious and spiritual hero of World War II. But I love this quote that Mark Brocker, an American theologian, writes about Bonhoeffer toward the bottom of that page. He writes, "The heart of Bonhoeffer's resistance was his confidence in God's deep love for the world. That deep love was the firm ground on which he took his stand in resisting Hitler and the Nazis." And I was thinking about that in the context of this chapter about justice and thinking about the fact that we have to understand that no matter what our stands for justice look like, that we too have to stand firm on the ground that we are loved deeply by God. And I think that's sometimes where the passion around justice comes from. because I would, at the top of 25, for the person of faith, acts of resistance are motivated by God's desire for justice born out of love, and that ultimately triumph over evil. And again, I think when we think about and when we talk about evil, those are complicated theological understandings. And when we other people and issues, that's complicated stuff. And that becomes difficult. And yet, I think as a church and as a congregation, we can continue to provide places to be educated, safe places for dialogue. And I know that the three of us, among all of us, are eager to welcome people back where we can do it in person as well. And so as we begin to wrap up, I want to invite closing thoughts and
Well, I want, I know you believe it, so it's just adding to your sentence that what we believe and affirm is not just that we are loved, but that every single person in this world is created and loved by God. And that's, in terms of this whole book, part of where these authors are going to take us is to what that means for our interactions with people of other faiths. And in terms of how the world is changing and what we're letting go of, one of the things that I mentioned last week is it is their premise that we have to let go of the idea that Christianity is the only way or the only right faith, and figure out how do we live together justly with other religions. And again, I think it's an easier starting point for us because we don't start with the assumption that, our job is to convert our Jewish friends. We stand with them and with our Muslim friends. But I think that's another letting go for a lot of people in this country, that we're not going to have a Christian nation where everybody has to be Christian and everything is determined by a Christian perspective on things. And that's a hard letting go for a lot of people.
it is. And it's part of, Deb, what you talked about with those shifting demographics, shifting understandings. I think we all have those differing understandings of what the world looks like in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. And so we have to be able to adapt and adjust. And I think if we're perfectly honest, that's easier for some than for others. And people deal with that in different ways.
And in response to what you said, Sharon, I think sometimes it's even harder for people of faith, especially Christians, to actually accept other Christians. I think the divisiveness is just as deep there.
Oh, I agree.
And I think that is one of the challenges. And so today we're talking about justice. Next week is about practicing kindness, which is another whole issue, and compassion. And not just with those of other faiths, but those within the Christian faith. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let that be the last word. But, we talked yesterday in our team meeting about the reality and the anxiety that we know we're facing as a nation as we go into the weekend before, and then, of course, next Wednesday at noon, the inauguration of a new president. So I'm going to invite us as we close to just join in a word of prayer as we go into that week. So let's join in prayer. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, a God of justice, a God of peace, we join our hearts this evening as we look to the future. We ask, O God, for a special blessing for our nation, for a peaceful transfer of power, for those who feel deep hurts to find peace, for those who feel deep victory to find humility, and for our nation to embrace the great traditions of our nation, for people of all faiths to join in prayer, and for all people to respond with respect, unity, and to recognize the equality of every person in this land. And so let us not respond in fear or violence. Let us respond with confidence and assurance that you are with us, that you walk with us, and that we are indeed beloved and called by name. And it is in that confidence that we offer this prayer in your many names and in the name of Jesus our Christ. Amen.
Thank you.
Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. And we look forward to seeing you next week as we look at chapter 3. And I can't remember who has the lead next week.
That would be me.
You're up next week?
I am.
Fantastic. And again, greetings from beautiful Naples, Florida. And we will see you next week.